afternoon and welcome. This is the UCCS Talk Series. Glad to see you all here. We have a good sized audience here in person with us and also on Zoom. I'm really excited about today's program. This, by the way, is the second and last of our summer speaker series program, but we will be resuming full blast in the fall, focusing on weather and water, artificial intelligence, and some technological innovations for solving California's biggest challenges. But today's panel is of particular interest to me, and I think it should be to all of us, because it touches on the general issue of wealth inequality, which is actually, if you think about it, an even more pressing and poignant issue than income inequality in the United States, because it's whereas income is important for day-to-day expenses, it's really that buffer of wealth that allows families to weather the need for a car repair, an unexpected healthcare expense, to potentially start a business to save for college for the next generation. And wealth in America is tied very much to homeownership. But homeownership itself is unequally allocated, and the value of homes in areas where Black, Latino, and immigrant communities live tends to be suppressed. So today we're pleased to welcome an interdisciplinary dual university panel of researchers to examine some of the roots of wealth inequality as embedded in housing discrimination, beginning a long time ago and extending into today. Robert Wasmer is professor of public policy and administration at Cal State University, Sacramento, where he's also a core faculty member and founder of the Doctorate in Educational Leadership program. His research interests include education as an escalator for social mobility, and most recently, the causes, consequences, and possible policy solutions to California's housing affordability crisis. Among his recent publications is an article appearing in the Journal of Urban Affairs, and this is the one that caught my attention. It's entitled Past Structural Racism and Present Home Prices, and this work will be the basis of some of his remarks today. Dr. Wasmer is a Michigan native, and he earned his PhD from Michigan State University. He's joined by Jose Loya, who is Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and a faculty affiliate with Chicano Studies Research Center. His research focuses on stratification in homeownership, including ethno-racial, gender, and Latino disparities in mortgage access, and he's received numerous fellowships, grants, and awards from UCLA and as well as the University of Pennsylvania, where he also earned his PhD in sociology. Prior to beginning his academic career, Professor Loya worked as a financial coach and advisor for several nonprofit concerns in South Florida. So some practical and academic experience, two great universities, and we welcome both of you. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz. It's a pleasure to be here. I definitely have been to these seminars in the past, being in Sacramento for 25 plus years in the old Weinstock building. Oftentimes came for the lunch, but I always enjoyed the presentation. So very, very much a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Yes, this is a piece of research that has forthcoming in the Journal of Urban Affairs. The PowerPoint will be put up on the web. It's 20 slides, which I violate my own rule that I tell my students about the number of slides per number of minutes. So I presented this in a longer format, so I'm using basically the same thing. I wanted to get it out there so others could take a look at it and kind of get the whole thing with it. But I'm going to move rather quickly on some things, and if you want to come back during the question period, we can deal with some of those. So I just wanted to put that out there from the very beginning. So let me get started. Oops. Advancing. I'm not getting the advanced going. What am I doing? There we go. Okay, now it's working. Excellent. Thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about is those maps that you often see on The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein's book, right, about redlining. Right, redlining has become a buzzword that people use, and I want to give you a little bit of background because I, heard about it, got interested in it, read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, talked about it in class, and decided to actually do some empirical investigation of it, actually in a graduate class that I teach, right? After begin some of my research with my graduate students doing some exploratory work on it. So this was the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, right? In the Great Depression, post-Great Depression, wanting to get people back into their homes, right? You give them mortgages with lower interest rates, extended payment schedules, and most important, amortization, right? That they could build some equity in their homes. So there was a federally group that was started to do this. They devised some appraisal practices, and these were federally subsidized loans that were given to people. When this program ended, the feds then asked them, let's create some maps, right? That would, based upon your experience in doing this, calling upon real estate banking professionals, draw some maps, right? And basically it can be characterized as a bunch of white men getting together in a room on a weekend, throwing down a map of an urban area and saying, where are the safe places to land, where are the more risky places to land, right? They filled out some field notes, right, which I'll show you in a moment, but those are often talked about as a kind of a smoking gun, right, in regard to structural, institutional, de jure racism that has gone on in this country, right? They graded these neighborhoods red through green, as mentioned there, right? And they become great visual reminders of our past, right? And you can look at all these maps; they've all been digitalized at the link that I've given you here. So this is the book, The Color of Law. Rothstein puts one of those maps himself up on it. Here is the map for Sacramento, right? Which this is the central city right here. East Sacramento in green, Land Park in green. Those were deemed the least riskiest. The blue were the second riskiest, and then we have the yellow and the red, right? The red deemed the most riskiest. Well, let me show you something, right? What they actually did in these assessments to justify them, right, was actually fill out forms like this, right? This is a form from East Sacramento, right? Favorable influences is the homogeneity of improvements and social and income levels, adequate deed restrictions, right? These were actually deed restrictions, asking that you were not going to transfer your property to a non-white, right? They were largely enforced by the real estate community and by sellers. I've heard real estate agents say it was in the best interest of both parties, right? It wasn't good for blacks to live in those neighborhoods, and whites did not want them to live in those neighborhoods. So it was kind of an agreement that went on all the way to the 60s and 70s, right? And I own a home in East Sacramento. I pulled out my deed; it's still in it, right? It's not enforcement, but these were there. So they were looking for things like that. In addition to having deed restrictions, zone, single family, homogeneity of architecture, homogeneity of people, right? They were basically choosing white neighborhoods with deed restrictions as being the green favorable. And then we go over to the red, then we look at, I have difficulty seeing this like this usually, the subversive character of the population, Mexicans, Negroes, and Orientals. Pardon my language, I'm quoting, right? These are actually written right down. That's why these are pointed to oftentimes as a smoking gun of this racism that was going on. So that is definitely the case. Here's another map you can take a look at where I quoted up above some of the green characteristics of what were in these, like I've already said, and some of the red characteristics. So it really does point to them that these were based in racism, in particularly against Blacks, African Americans, right? These were published in 1938. As mentioned, there were prominent racial covenants in home deeds. There's a lot of evidence by sociologists and urban people that, these neighborhoods did experience mortgage inability, They were primarily rental neighborhoods, and they saw a decline in neighborhood quality up to that point and after that. And you can look at the map that I showed you, and the affluent areas still remain, the land parks, the East Sacramento. Some of the redlined areas were also subject to urban redevelopment, right? These were areas, the Capitol Mall was a prominent middle-class Black neighborhood that was bulldozed for urban development. That was a red area that was listed there. The blue and yellow line neighborhoods remained basically the same, mixed commercial, vintage homes, and walkable. What I want to point out, which I don't think a lot of people realize, and I didn't realize until I started this, is these Hope maps were a consequence of structural racism, and they weren't a cause of continuing racism. John Oliver, right, on his show last week tonight, did a whole thing on this. You can go back and take a look at it. They quoted it in my paper, pointing to this as kind of a smoking gun, right? These maps were drawn, then they were used to direct housing mortgage policy. That's not the case, right? In fact, when you go back and look at Hope, that group of people, they disproportionately offered mortgages to African Americans, to Blacks, and to low-income people, right? It's just a group of people that got together in the end and wrote this down that the federal government thought was a good idea. Did this. Now the FHA is a whole nother story, right? The FHA came along after this, contemporary to it. They created their own red line maps, right? And policies that were definitely discriminated against BIPOC, a definite pro-white bias in their granting. These are appropriately discussed as a reason for why there's less wealth that's been accumulated among Blacks, African Americans, right? Even the GI Bill and such coming back, having the opportunity to buy, definitely steering them away from certain neighborhoods that enjoyed greater appreciation. So why are the Hope maps discussed widely, not the FHA maps? I didn't even know. The FHA destroyed all their maps, right? When there was the federal government was facing a lawsuit in discrimination, what do? You just destroy the smoking gun, destroy the evidence, right? The Hope maps were put in the National Archives, right? Kept there. They have a record in the National Archives. They were not really even accessed, right? So I think that I think is a fascinating thing to recall. So what good are the Hope maps? Why am I using the Hope maps? Because I think it points a picture at that time in regard to the structural and institutional racism that was in the minds of real estate people, bankers, real estate agents, right? And is that type of thinking that this is a red neighborhood, this is a green neighborhood, does that still carry over to home sales right now? Right, that's the basis of the title, past structural racism, present home prices. I'm going to skip over that research, but people have looked at the correlation between the Hope and the FHA, and there isn't much in regard to between the two. So there's been a bunch of studies that have been done that I'm not going to go into detail here, but more using census tract data, right? In census tract data, they have housing prices, but it's self-reported housing prices, and then the correlation between a red line and green line neighborhoods. And there is a correlation, that in red line neighborhoods in 1990, the prices are about the self-reported prices are about 5% lower on average in these census tracts. And there's also been studies in regard to other outcomes that you may have been familiar with, right? About especially in the medical community, right? Asthma being greater, less green space, more tree canopy in green communities. Growing up on the C side of a C to B boundary, C being worse than the B boundary, household income is about 3% lower than growing up on the B side, right? So these are just basically correlations. So this is the research. There's been some also about individual outcomes. People in redlined areas are more likely to rate their overall health negatively. Greater risk for preterm birth or late stage diagnosis of cancer, health treatment disparities between the areas. Controlling for race and poverty, even in these neighborhoods, the rate of gunshot victims is greater in a red line zone, 5 times greater than in a non-red line zone. So there's a lot of that out there, right? But I really wanted to look at, in these D and C neighborhoods, these red line and these yellow line neighborhoods compared to the B and compared to the A and B, is there a difference in the selling price of homes right now? And I was really unable to locate a regression study that had done this, a statistical study that had taken a look at it. So like I said, I began this in my master's level course and got some interesting results and then decided to continue it. And why is this important? As mentioned, because of the racial differences in intergenerational wealth. This can actually point to that, right? Because Blacks were more likely to live in these redlined areas. And you can see that actually right now, right? That the net worth of the average white household is 10 times greater than the average Black household. 70% of white households own their homes as compared to less than half of Black households. So I wanted to get a direct test of this, if I can put some actual numbers to that, to kind of bring some attention to this, right? This is not the only thing that we should be concerned about, but it's something that possibly could be directly measured. So what I'm going to do is a statistical regression model, right? We don't need to get into all the details of that, but you basically take a dependent variable, something that you're trying to see variation in, and then try to explain what's causing that variation. And holding everything else constant, ceteris paribus, what economists like to talk about. We want to see, okay, if a similar home, as close to similar as we can possible, is in a green line neighborhood of the 1930s as compared to a red line neighborhood, how much difference is the selling price? Right? And this comes from multiple listing service data, from actual real estate, actual sales, which is an advantage over some of the previous studies, which were self-reported. You may get the bias, I live in this red line neighborhood, my home value was lower. Well, we really want to see what it actually sold for, not what you actually feel like it is. So I feel that these are valuable. And I'm also going to control for zip code and school district effects, right? Which cross over these red line and green line areas, because that's what people look at also, the amenities, or disamenities across the zip code and across the school district. So I'm not going to go through all this, but you can see I have the neighborhood characteristics, which are my key variables, right? That I'm trying to look at in regard to these whole categories and the effect that they have. And then some home characteristics, which is pretty much standard. That's how you get the same home put into a different area. And then some of the selling characteristics, when it's sold, what year, what month, how many days on the market, right? So it's pretty standard. Housing economists would call it a pretty robust hedonic model in regard to looking, though not everything's in there. It's all that we could get. And I looked at sales pre-pandemic, August 2019 to February 2020, 456 sales. This is just in the categorized neighborhoods in the city of Sacramento. Tried different functional forms, did robust regression analysis because heteroscedasticity error terms can be clustered by can be correlated across within a zip code. Did that, and basically I'm looking at these dummy variables, holding everything else constant. What was the selling price difference being in an A, B, C, or D? Right. The base actually is the A neighborhood, the highest rated neighborhood, or the AB neighborhood that I look at. And you can see by just looking at the averages, these are the average sales prices during that time period, that the A was 750, the B was lower at 687, the C went down to 451, the D was slightly higher. The reason there is those D neighborhoods undergone a lot of rehabilitation, like tear downs, new things that were being built there. So you see that in the raw data. But the characteristics of the homes may be different that were rebuilt there. That'll be picked up in my regression analysis. The results are here. They're complicated. Those of you who want to look at them, you can. But the key points are up there in regard to the Hope C and D categories, right up there in that first. Well, I think I have a. Where is it? Right up here, right? That the C category, a home being in the C category, sold for 15.1% less. A home in the D category sold for 19.4% less. as compared to that similar home was in the A category, in a green line neighborhood, right? I mean, so for those of you who know East Sacramento, there are small bungalows in those green line neighborhoods. There are also small bungalows in Oak Park, right? And those who shop maybe in those neighborhoods, you can see some of those prices. The homes are basically the same. I'm controlling for the school district and the zip code also, right? But it's a part of this historical result of these things being characterized that way, that mortgages were not granted there, people did not move there, the neighborhood took a different path, and you see some of that in the socioeconomics, the health outcomes, the amenities that are in those neighborhoods. And then if you just compare B to actually, you compare CD right here, CD to AB, right, the lowest to the top, they're 13.3% less. These are statistically significant p-values less than 0.01. It's a pretty strong and robust relationship. So that's kind of what what I found. I also did a Blinder Oaxaca decomposition, which isn't regression analysis, but it's a comparison between the two, and found a similar result. Labor economists do this a lot to look at how people with similar characteristics, males versus females, how they are paid in looking at the average wages and controlling for other factors. So that's the same thing that's happening here in regard to that, about 1/3 of the difference in prices between the AB predicted home value of 611,000 compared to the CD home value of 416,000. These are actual sales. Is due to discrimination, right? So it's another way of looking at the same thing. So there's definitely been some continuation of these ratings, right? This is more now de facto type of discrimination that's going on that will be talked about in regard to mortgages and the difficulty of acquiring mortgages in the AB versus the CD. So the idea is, what can we do about this? What should we do about how does this guide this, right? So there's been work on regard to how do we overcome some of these disparities, baby bonds, homestead acts, education finance reforms, right? Those are all ideas, right, that have been put forward. We have our own reparations committee that's offering some guidance on that right now. In the planning community, there's things called reparative type of city planning, right, where you consider the past injustices and you steer planning practices to overcome some of that. And what I've talked about even in the student discussion we had earlier is the need to squelch some of the NIMBYism, some of the neighborhood resistance to bringing more affordable housing in, as as an answer to what's happened to this. I'm going to conclude right now is, okay, those are all great ideas, Wasmer, but where are you going to get the money for them? Right? And I'm just going to throw out one idea. It's rather controversial. I can tell you all the political and institutional reasons why it's very difficult to happen, but it did happen in Los Angeles. This is a real estate transfer tax, right? When you sell your home, that you have to pay a percentage to the state and to the locality. The state is relatively low. A $5 million house is only $5,500. But in Los Angeles, they levy their own additional taxes, which brings that $5 million house to about $28,000. But in Los Angeles, they passed Measure ULA, which is a homeless and housing solutions tax, right? That's been in effect just since April 2nd, and it's now raises on this $5 million house an additional $200,000, right? So the idea is that you're taking these very affluent homes, taxing them, bringing that revenue in to do things with homeless and housing issues. Well, why not do something like that at the state level, right? A real estate transfer tax on property sales, and again, to make it equitable, you can say above the median home price for homes that were in green and blue line neighborhoods, right? That were a result of this, and maybe households that have lived there for a long time, putting a tax on that. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but that would be a way to raise revenue and maybe find one way of having some reparative type of justice, right? Now, this is different than the proposed all taxpayer generated reparations, right, to slave descendants. Because I think it has a more direct connection of payment from those who benefited from being in a blue and green line neighborhood to those that have been hurt. That's why I specifically had set those time deadlines. So that's just one idea that's put forth. And that's really where the reparations, the current reparations committee is going to have issues with that connection between who imposed this, who was hurt by it, who was helped by it, to raise the revenue. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I appreciate your questions at the end. Thank you. Give me one moment just so I can set up. I'm also going to put a timer for myself because, like most professors, we like to talk once we get going. So let's begin. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Loya. I'm an assistant professor at UCLA in the Department of Urban Planning. And today I'm going to be discussing some of my current work entitled Ethno-Racial and Creditworthiness Disparities in Access to Mortgage Credit. So let's begin. Home ownership is central to the financial security for most Americans. In fact, for most of us in this room and online, owning a home will probably be the biggest purchase in our lifetime. Home ownership is also the largest vehicle for creating wealth in the US. It's not stocks or bonds or owning a small business, it's purchasing a home. We also, as a society, value and subsidize home ownership, mostly through the form of tax subsidies, or in the US tax codes, like mortgage interest deduction. Right? However, we know that differential access to home ownership is a key contributor to ethno and racial inequality. For example, the home ownership disparities between whites and Latinos and Blacks is about 25 percentage points. We also know that homeowners, on average, have access to better quality schools, healthcare, and neighborhoods overall compared to those that don't own a home. In addition, home ownership is also an important source of massive inequality in inheritance. Even with the recent tax reform, essentially families can pass along a home of up to $500,000 in profits, essentially tax-free to their children. This has major implications when we talk about wealth inequality, but more specifically, the racial wealth gap in the US, not just for this generation, but for future generations as well. Now, when we think about racial and ethnic disparities in homeownership, there are two main theoretical frameworks. The first is the life cycle and human capital perspective. Here, homeownership reflects differential tastes and preferences subject to financial constraints. This makes sense, right? People that are older, have higher levels of education, a stable job, higher income, they tend to want and tend to own a home. In other words, if you have more resources, you tend to gravitate towards homeownership. However, large ethno-racial differences in homeownership remain even after accounting for these socio-demographic characteristics, which brings me to the second theoretical framework, the racial and ethnic stratification perspective. This is where my research lies. Here, researchers document the long history of discrimination in the mortgage market, right? As the previous professor documented. We also know that there's disparate treatment at both the individual and community levels. For instance, HUD and even their most actually it's not recent anymore, but essentially has documented that minorities are often steered towards low-income minority neighborhoods compared to white home seekers. We also know that minorities are generally offered higher cost or mortgage or denied at higher levels than similar whites. So why creditworthiness? Well, I define creditworthiness as debt to income level. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And the debt to income ratio is an important factor in determining eligibility for a mortgage. It measures an applicant's monthly short-term debt obligations relative to their monthly gross income. It's commonly used by lending institutions, as well as government-backed securities, to determine an applicant's economic risk or financial risk. However,
We also know that there's tremendous variation in DTI levels across applicants. For example, about 40% of home seekers tend to have excellent DTI levels, meaning they have low debt to income ratios. We also know that about 25% of home seekers have poor debt to DTI levels as well. So how do we tie in creditworthiness, race and ethnicity, and housing? Well, I argue that including an applicant's creditworthiness allows for a more accurate study of ethno-racial stratification in housing. And that's because most prior studies on a national scale have been confined to using income and loan amount as proxies for creditworthiness. In fact, prior to 2018, no federal data set or publicly available data set contained any type of credit indicators for an applicant. For the few studies that do include creditworthiness, they often have to focus, or they're confined to focusing on specific municipalities, thus limiting the studies to forms of generalizability. A famous study by Alicia Munell in 1992, which is my inspiration, so I have like a little paper of her on my thing, right? Did a famous study about racial discrimination in housing in Boston because she had access to this type of private data. But Boston looks very different than the rest of the country, right? So it's not generalizable. Now, failing to account for creditworthiness could potentially distort and overestimate our evaluation of the relative position of different ethno-racial groups in housing. So today, my research question is pretty simple. What are the ethno-racial disparities in institutional mortgage outcomes when considering the creditworthiness of mortgage applicants? We're going to take a look at 2018 and 19. More generally, how does a more accurate accounting of economic indicators shape our view of ethno-racial stratification? To answer this, we'll first go through some basic descriptive statistics. And then we'll evaluate net of borrower and loan characteristics, differential loan outcomes across ethno-racial and credit worthiness. Now, the data set that I'll be using is called HMDA, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. It's a federally publicly available data set that details mortgage transactions from the CRA lending institutions for the years 2018 and 19. Now, this data set stems back all the way to the early 1990s, but it gets messier and dirtier. And every few years, there's updates. So prior to 2018, we didn't have any indicators like creditworthiness or down payment levels or interest rates. And so I kind of avoided that, right? Because we want to get a more accurate understanding of the lending market. Now, for each mortgage transaction, we have the following information that's contained in the data set. We have borrower and co-borrower demographic and economic indicators, institutional characteristics, and loan characteristics. However, I do want to be upfront about the limitations of this data set, right? First, we don't contain marital status or the borrower credit score and wealth, right? Because of that, we're confined to understanding the structural position of different ethno-racial groups within the housing market. We're not able to point out any discriminatory practices that are occurring in the mortgage market because we are missing these important economic variables still. However, in 2018, like I said, there were new adjustments to this data set. So now we actually have down payment, sales price, and interest rate, as well as credit worthiness, right? So I kind of leave that because those used to be on my slides before, and now I get to cross them out anytime I do a new study. Now I've restricted the HMDA data set to non-institutional applicants requesting financing for owner-occupied single-family homes in the US through a conventional or jumbo mortgage. In other words, if an individual was trying to buy a home to live in and not necessarily an investment or second home, they're in the data set and they're in the sample. Because of that, we have a total of 3.3 million mortgage applicants for this study. So we have more than enough in our sample. Now, what's our dependent variable? Well, I define a mortgage outcome as 3 potential outcomes. The first is a conventional loan origination, right? Yippee, that's actually what most home buyers want. When they go into the mortgage market, they want to be approved for a conventional loan outcome, a fixed rate, low cost mortgage. Boom, that's our first mortgage outcome. If they're not provided a conventional loan, they can also be provided a high cost loan. And HMDA defines a high cost loan as any mortgage origination that has an interest rate of 1.5 percentage points higher than the average prime rate at the time. So these are loans that are essentially have a much higher interest rate than your typical conventional loan. And finally, if you're not approved for a loan, you can also be denied. Right? In the data set, they do have the reasons for your denial. I've combed through them, I've separated them, I've combined them and found very similar results as to why, as to the mortgage denial outcome. So I kind of just combined them into to save us some space, and more specifically, there's no differences. So it just they're all combined into a mortgage denial. Now, the primary independent variables are two. First is the race and ethnicity of the primary borrower. Right? We're going to look at non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic Asians, and Latinos. Unfortunately, we don't have enough Native Americans and Pacific Islanders across because of spatial distribution and spatial distribution of these populations that I didn't get consistent coefficients for them. Now, the second variable is the debt to income ratio. And I define this into 4 different categories. First, if an applicant has a DTI of less than 36%, they're considered to have excellent DTI. These are standards that actually most financial institutions use. And so this is what I've also used. Now, DTI between 37 and 40, I define as above average DTI. Between 41 and 45%, a below average DTI. And a DTI greater than 45% is considered poor. Now, the 45% and greater is taken from FHA, because they actually have strict guidelines as to how, what they're willing to insure when it comes to DTI levels. Now, in the model stage, we're going to control for economic, demographic, loan, neighborhood, and locational characteristics. I'm happy to talk about that and how these were defined later at the end of the talk, if people are interested. Again, we're going to look at descriptive statistics to assess the prevalence of DTI levels by race and ethnicity with respect to mortgage outcomes. And in the multivariate stage, we're going to examine a multinomial logistic regression model with robust standard errors of mortgage outcomes. Now, the benefits of this model is that it produces efficient coefficients. It corrects for some of the underestimation of standard errors that occurs from having neighborhood level covariates in the model. Not all of it, but some of it. And more importantly, it utilizes the entire data set, all 3.3 million observations. Now, I tried other like HLM or hierarchical linear modeling. However, it's computationally intensive. And to a certain extent, you can reduce, because of that, I had to use the stratified random samples, and you kind of lose some stuff. And so let's stick with the one that's a basic model, but can give us and utilize the entire data set. So let's begin with descriptive statistics. Now, this is just a trivariate figure, with no controls. The first level at the bottom, you'll see is the race and ethnicity of the borrower. They could be white, Asian, Latino, or black. The second level is the DTI level. They can have less than 36%, 37 to 40, 41 to 45, and greater than 46%. Right? We're going to first take a look at mortgage outcomes by race and ethnicity and DTI level. And as you can see, we have a couple of diverging trends. First, we notice that across racial or ethno-racial groups, that whites and Asians tend to have higher levels of conventional loans than Latinos and blacks, right? For example, white and Asians that have excellent DTI levels, right, receive a conventional loan about 85 to 90% of the time. If we compare them to if we compare them to Latino and blacks with excellent DTI levels, we see that they only receive a conventional loan about 70% of the time. When we look among ethno-racial groups, we see a different pattern. We see that as your DTI levels gets poor, right? We see that your rate of conventional loans goes down. This makes sense. You're becoming a riskier borrower, so you're less likely to get a conventional loan. Kind of what we should expect, right? So we see a decline over DTI levels. When we look at the intersection of race and ethnicity, though, of race and ethnicity and DTI levels, we see an alarming pattern. More specifically, when we look at Latino and blacks with excellent DTI levels, we see that they get a conventional loan about 70% of the time, which is similar to whites and Asians that have the poorest DTI levels. But again, maybe what we're seeing is misleading. There's no controls here. I told you DTI levels differ across ethno-racial groups and applicants. We also know that they differ across socioeconomic status, across different racial and ethnic groups. So maybe what we're seeing is actually a function of socio-demographic differences and not necessarily race and ethnicity. So let's take a look at the model where we control for all these socioeconomic and socio-demographic characteristics. Here is the first figure, or the second figure. We're going to look at the adjusted predicted probabilities from the multivariate model. We're going to look at high-cost loan origination rates per applicant. Once again, the race and ethnicity of borrowers here at the first level. The second level is the DTI level. Once again, we would read this as a white applicant with excellent DTI level, all the way to a white applicant with a poor DTI level. And we can do that across ethno-racial groups. Let's take a look at everything when we control for socio-demographic and socioeconomic status, right? And once again, we see a diverging trend. We see that whites and Asians in general have lower rates of getting a high-cost loan than Blacks and Latinos controlling for all our characteristics. More specifically, we see that whites and Asians with excellent DTI levels receive a high-cost loan about 7.5% of the time, compared to a Latino and Black applicant that receive with excellent DTIs that receive a high-cost loan about 12.5% of the time, almost double. When we look among ethno-racial groups, we see a similar trend as before. Right? Once again, we see that high-cost loan rates increase as your debt-to-income ratio increases or gets poorer. That makes sense. That's what we know, right? They're riskier borrowers. However, when we look at that intersection between race and ethnicity and DTI levels, once again, we see an alarming trend. We see that Latino and Black applicants with excellent DTI levels perform similarly as whites and Asians with poor DTI levels, controlling for all other socioeconomic characteristics. Now let's take a look at mortgage denials. Now we see a different trend, right? We saw that kind of an upward sloping trend before, but once again, we see a similar story about race and ethnicity. We see that whites and Asians have slightly lower denial rates than Asians or than Latinos and Blacks generally. However, when it comes to the DTI level or among ethno-racial groups, we see that it's relatively flat. In general, it appears that lenders really like to deny individuals that have really poor DTI levels. But before that, it's kind of static, right? It's kind of flat, right? And we see that across all ethno-racial groups. However, when we look at that intersection between race and ethnicity and DTI levels, we see a similar, but not as terrible trend. We see that Latino and Black applicants, right, with excellent DTI levels, right, perform similarly and actually slightly perform worse than whites and Asians with below average DTI levels. So still not equal. So let me share the summary of my findings. Well, I showed you tremendous variation in loan outcomes across creditworthiness. I also showed you that ethno-racial disparities in the mortgage market exist even after considering the applicant's creditworthiness. That there's important variation in loan outcomes by race and ethnicity and creditworthiness. And that Black and Latino applicants are more likely to be rejected and obtain a high cost origination across DTI levels compared to whites. Depending on the adverse loan outcome, Asians perform similarly or slightly underperform compared to whites. When examining high-cost originations, Blacks and Latinos with excellent creditworthiness perform similarly as whites and Asians with below-average credit. The implications. Black and Latino home seekers generally have lower levels of creditworthiness, making it more difficult for these minority groups to access credit products to accumulate assets and wealth. Even Black and Latino home seekers with excellent credit profiles find it difficult to obtain similar mortgages as whites and Asians. Because of this, home ownership opportunities for Blacks and Latinos is more limited, even among those with excellent creditworthiness. Overall, because I am a sociologist that study race and ethnicity, right? The study supports and contradicts certain elements of our understanding of the theoretical ethno-racial hierarchies in the US. Whites, regardless of creditworthiness, are generally the most advantaged. Blacks are generally the most disadvantaged in accessing mortgage credit. Asians perform similarly or slightly underperform compared to whites, while Latinos perform similarly or slightly outperform compared to blacks. More specifically, I argue that we need to continue to pay more attention to the ethno-racial hierarchy in the US and the relative positions in the system of ethno-racial stratification. In terms of policy, because I know I have 1 minute, right? There's a link that will be sent out with the policy brief that's specifically about Los Angeles. But in general, I call for 3 different things when investigating this. The first is we need to reevaluate how we think about credit scores, right? Thinking about access, because Latinos and blacks are actually more likely to go from being renters to homeowners. We need to think about ways to incorporate rental payments or on-time payments for rent, utilities as part of our credit score, or as part of our understanding of building credit in our credit history. The second is that because Latinos and blacks already have lower wealth levels, we need to continue to invest in down payment assistance programs at the local level to allow, to enable these to enable these minorities, right, to lower their economic risk, but more specifically, lower the cost of home ownership in these really expensive places. And finally, our data is still constrained, and we need to continue to advance and allow and expand the number of indicators so that we can actually track what the Community Reinvestment Act was intended to do, which is discriminatory practices in home ownership. Having these variables that I showed you not available is honestly is not a good thing. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Wassmer and Dr. Loya, for that fantastic talk today. And so we are going to go ahead and move on to our Q&A portion of our talk. And so similarly to our past Wednesday speaker series, we'll go ahead and take questions from our audience as well as questions from our Zoom audience. And so we'll go ahead and start with our in-person audience first. So if you can go ahead and raise your hand, I'll go ahead and pass you the